Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. The contract looked clean enough on heavy cream paper bearing the official letterhead of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Maintenance Division, offering $1,200 a week for 6 weeks of solitary trail clearing and boundary marking in the restricted upper basin of Hazel Creek, a stretch of wilderness so thoroughly isolated that the hiring agent didn't even look me in the eye when he slid the keys across the scarred mahogany desk in the ranger station at Tennessee, saying most boys last about 3 days before they pack their gear and drive back down the gravel road with their high beams on. I laughed it off, thinking I needed the cash after my survey business went under in Knoxville, and loaded my Ford pickup with 2 weeks of canned rations, a heavy canvas tarp, a box of steel marker spikes, and a pair of brand new timber boots that still smelled of factory glue. The drive up into the mountains took nearly 3 hours past the abandoned mining sites and rusted-out chassis of old logging trucks, half swallowed by thick fern beds, the paved road turning into a packed dirt track that narrowed until the overhanging hemlock branches scraped against both sides of my truck windows like long skeletal fingers testing the glass. By late afternoon, the signal on my phone had completely flat, lined into a dead screen, and the air grew noticeably colder, carrying a sharp, wet mineral scent of decaying leaves and stagnant river water that clung to the roof of my mouth. I crossed the old iron bridge spanning Hazel Creek, its wooden planks groaning heavily under the tires as the dark, peat-stained water rushed silently below, swirling around moss-covered boulders that looked like teeth breaking through the surface of a shallow jaw. A few miles past the bridge, the track ended abruptly in a small turnaround, choked with wild blackberry briars and tall dead thistle, right beside a weathered cabin built from hand, hewn chestnut logs that had turned the color of wet ash. This was home for the next 6 weeks. Station 7, the maps called it, though my personal topographical map had a blank. Hand-drawn circle stamped directly over the entire watershed with red ink, marking it as state property closed to public recreation due to unstable soil conditions. I parked the truck facing outward, killed the engine, and stepped out onto the damp earth. The silence here wasn't the peaceful quiet of a country afternoon. It was a heavy, pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck all ambient noise out of the air, leaving only the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears and the distant, hollow dripping of water somewhere deep within the dense timber. I unlocked the heavy oak door of the cabin, the iron hinges screaming in protest as they swung inward, to reveal a single dusty room, furnished with a sagging iron cot, a small cast iron wood stove choked with gray ash, and a rough wooden table where a kerosene lantern sat beside a thick, leather-bound notebook with water-stained pages. I tossed my duffel bag onto the cot, the springs groaning sharply, and walked over to the table to inspect the notebook, assuming it was just a maintenance log left behind by previous workers. But when I flipped the heavy cover open, the first page wasn't filled with equipment inventories or mileage counts. It was a list of handwritten rules scrawled in dark, fading ink by someone named Carl Remy, dated nearly 40 years ago. The handwriting was shaky and hurried, pressed so hard into the paper that the nib had torn small holes through the fiber. Rule 1. It read, if your steel tools are piled into a geometric spiral at sunrise, do not touch them, leave them for the ridge. Rule 2. Never hunt or set snares in the lower basin. And if you find a carcass torn by bare hands, walk away without looking back. Rule 3. When the clicking starts in the canopy at night, do not shine your flashlight upward. Pull your blanket over your face and count backward from 100. Rule 4. If you discover a rusted tin can filled with river stones on your doorstep, it means your presence is recorded. Do not leave your cabin after midnight. Rule 5. Should the timber trail be blocked by freshly felled oak trees forming a barrier, never turn back toward the valley. You must cross the dry creek bed where the water runs silent. Rule 6. If you meet them at the edge of the water, and they mimic your movements. Raise your open palm and give no voice. Break the silence, and you belong to the creek. I stared at the words, a cold knot tightening in the center of my chest, a faint laugh escaping my throat as I tried to convince myself it was just some kind of sick hazing ritual left behind by Park Service veterans who liked messing with the new guys. I snapped the book shut, picked up my heavy steel axe and my box of boundary markers from the truck bed, and decided to walk the first quarter mile of the northern trail before sunset to get my bearings and prove to myself that this was just a normal stretch of government timber. The path was choked with thick mountain laurel and waste, high ferns that brushed coldly against my denim work pants, soaking them instantly with heavy evening dew. Overhead, the sky was a bruised, sickly violet, the pale sun sliding down behind the jagged silhouette of the ridge, like a dying ember dropped into deep water. I walked for 20 minutes, driving iron spikes into the thick bark of ancient white oaks every 100 paces to mark the legal boundary of the national park, my hammer blows echoing through the silent valley with a sharp, metallic ring that felt entirely too loud, as if I were shouting in a crowded cathedral. The forest around me seemed to shift and thicken, the shadows stretching into long, unnatural shapes that didn't match the angle of the setting sun. I told myself it was just fatigue from the long drive, and the thin mountain air playing tricks on my eyes. But every time I stopped to wipe the sweat from my forehead, the absolute silence of the woods would return instantly, pressing down against my eardrums until I could hear my own heart thumping in my throat. I reached a small clearing where the trail intersected with a dry tributary of Hazel Creek, and that was when I saw the tools, neatly arranged in a perfect, clockwise spiral on the damp black moss at the base of a massive, gnarled hemlock tree, my steel axe, my 3 iron wedges, and my canvas tool pouch, which I distinctly remember leaving zipped shut on the passenger seat of my truck 4 miles back down the winding trail. I froze, my hand hovering mid-air as the memory of Carl Remy's first rule flashed sharply across my mind. A sudden, freezing gust of wind swept down through the hemlock boughs, carrying with it a distinct, foul odor like rotting river silt and wet animal fur. I didn't touch the spiral. I didn't lean down to inspect how my locked truck door had been bypassed. I simply took 2 slow steps backward, kept my eyes fixed on the twisting branches above, and began my long, hurried walk back to the cabin before the deep dark settled over Hazel Creek. The morning sun never really reached the bottom of Hazel Creek. It merely turned the dense fog hovering over the cabin from a deep obsidian into a pale, milky gray that smelled of wet slate and stagnant mud. I woke up abruptly at 6 o'clock, my hands clamped tight around the wooden handle of my heavy hunting knife, my knuckles white and stiff from holding the iron blade against my chest all night, while listening to the structural timber of the cabin groan against the damp mountain wind. My skin felt tacky and cold, covered in a thin layer of dry sweat, and my mouth tasted of rusted iron from clenching my teeth in my sleep. I swung my legs over the side of the iron cot, my leather boots making a wet, hollow thud against the bare pine floorboards as I pulled them on and tied the laces tight around my ankles. Reaching for the kerosene lantern, I found the glass chimney was covered in a thin, greasy film of black soot that hadn't been there when I went to sleep. Tracing my thumb over the curved glass, I felt tiny, raised ridges in the grime, small, deliberate loops that looked alarmingly like the whorls of a human fingerprint. I wiped my hand on my pants, swallowed hard against the lump rising in my throat, and unlatched the heavy oak door to face the second day of my contract. The air outside hit my face like an icy towel, thick with a heavy, suffocating moisture that hung in the air without falling as rain, making it difficult to expand my lungs fully. I stepped off the porch onto the packed dirt, keeping my eyes low, taking a deep breath before looking toward the edge of the clearing where the forest began its steep ascent toward the upper ridge. My truck sat entirely untouched on its flat tires, its hood covered in a thick layer of pine needles. But 20 feet away, laid out in the center of the turning loop, was the exact same geometric spiral of steel tools I had abandoned by the dry tributary the night before. My heavy double, Bit-axe sat at the absolute center of the coil, its sharp edge driven 2 inches deep into a flat piece of sandstone, while my iron boundary spikes, my heavy wooden mallet, my folding steel saw, and my brass measuring tape were laid out around it in tight, clockwise rings. The precision was terrifying, every item placed at equal intervals, spaced so perfectly that it looked like the work of a draftsman using a mechanical compass. I stood dead still on the cabin steps, my breath rising in short, ragged plumes of gray steam, remembering the first rule written in Carl Remy's notebook with an icy, visceral clarity: if your steel tools are piled into a geometric spiral at sunrise, do not touch them, leave them for the ridge. My instincts, honed by years of field work and practical survival, screamed at me to march over, grab my $400 toolkit, and throw it into the back of my truck. But the absolute silence of the clearing made my hands freeze at my sides. There were no birds calling from the high canopy, no squirrels moving through the leaf litter, not even the faint buzzing of black flies that usually swarmed the wet hollows of the Smoky Mountains at dawn. The forest was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would reach down and break the pattern. I turned my back on the steel spiral, leaving every piece of iron sitting in the wet grass, and walked back into the cabin to grab my spare wooden survey stakes and a heavy hickory walking stick I had carved during my second year at university. If the mountain wanted my steel, it could keep it for now. I had 3 miles of boundary line to clear along the eastern ridge before the fog turned back into blackness. The trail leading up from the turnaround was steep and slick with decaying red oak leaves that turned to slick paste under the heavy soles of my boots. The mountain rose up around me like the walls of a massive, green trench, the ancient hemlocks leaning inward until their dark upper branches intertwined, blocking out the sky entirely and creating a twilight world where everything looked shadow, gray, and distorted. I walked with a steady, rhythmic pace, my wooden stick striking the ground with a dull thud every 2 steps, keeping my eyes focused on the narrow path directly in front of my toes. After half a mile, the trail narrowed into a ledge barely 2 feet wide, clinging to the sheer rock face of the eastern gorge, where the creek raged down in the darkness hundreds of feet below. As I turned a sharp bend where a massive slab of wet granite jutted out over the path, the smell hit me first, a thick, sweetish reek of hot copper, fresh stomach bile, and rotting wet hair that made my stomach heave instantly. I stopped dead in my tracks, my hickory stick pressed hard against the rock face to steady my balance. 10 feet ahead of me, suspended 3 feet off the ground between 2 young birch trees, was the fresh carcass of a full, grown white-tailed deer. It wasn't hanging from a rope or a steel wire. Its long neck was wedged violently into the tight fork of the trees, its hind legs dangling limply over the sheer drop of the gorge. But what made the blood drain entirely from my face was the body itself. The deer hadn't been shot by a hunter's rifle or torn apart by a black bear or a cougar. Its rib cage had been split wide open from the sternum to the pelvis in one clean, continuous motion. The thick hide peeled back on both sides and neatly folded against its flanks like the pages of a leather book. Every single internal organ had been completely removed, leaving the chest cavity entirely empty. Bone, dry and scraped smooth down to the white ribs. There were no jagged tear marks on the meat, no puncture holes from claws, and no sign of a metal blade having cut through the cartilage. The flesh had been separated from the bone with an impossible, terrifying precision, as if it had been unzipped by hands that possessed unimaginable, crushing force. Sitting on a flat stone, directly beneath the dangling hooves of the carcass, was a small pile of damp, gray river silt. Pressed into the silt were 5 deep, distinct indentations that matched the shape of a human hand. The fingers twice as long as my own, ending in flat, square tips that had pressed deep into the mud. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, my throat so dry I couldn't summon enough saliva to swallow. Carl Remy's second rule echoed through the cold hollows of my mind. Never hunt or set snares in the lower basin, and if you find a carcass torn by bare hands, walk away without looking back. A heavy, wet snap sounded from the thick mountain laurel thicket directly above the carcass. followed by the slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy sliding over wet bark. It wasn't the quick, agile movement of an animal. It was a heavy, deliberate drag, accompanied by a low, wet rasp that sounded like wet leather being pulled across a rough stone. I didn't look up into the branches. I didn't reach for my knife. I simply planted my heels into the wet shale of the path, turned my entire body around in one rigid motion, and began walking back down the narrow ledge toward the cabin, my wooden stick striking the stone in a fast, desperate beat. Behind me, high up in the foggy canopy of the birch trees, the slow, rhythmic clicking began, a dry, woody sound like two polished bone sticks being struck together over and over, following me step for step as I descended back into the dark depths of Hazel Creek. The dusk fell over Hazel Creek like a heavy wet sheet thrown over an open grave, blotting out the last sickly threads of pale gray light that had filtered through the hemlock canopy. Inside the cabin, the cold had settled deep into the floorboards, creeping up through the soles of my boots until my ankles felt stiff and numb. I sat at the rough pine table with the kerosene lantern turned down to a low amber flicker, the glass chimney still stained with those greasy loops that looked like elongated fingerprints. In my right hand, I held Carl Remy's notebook, my thumb resting on the third rule, reading the shaky ink over and over until the words lost their meaning and became nothing more than dark scratches on damp paper. Rule 3. When the clicking starts in the canopy at night, do not shine your flashlight upward. Pull your blanket over your face and count backward from 100. My heavy hunting knife lay open on the wood beside the lantern, its steel blade reflecting the dim flame. But I knew with a terrible certainty that 5 inches of tempered steel would mean nothing against whatever had unzipped that deer's ribcage with its bare hands. The cabin's single window, a small 4-pane square of thick, leaded glass facing the northern woods, had turned into a pitch-black mirror that reflected only my own hollow eyes and pale face back at me. Outside, the mountain wind had completely died down, leaving an absolute stillness so profound that every creak of the drying chestnut logs sounded like a gunshot in the small room. At 9 o'clock, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted abruptly, my breath turning into thick white clouds that hovered motionless in the air. The small flame of the kerosene lamp sputtered, shrinking to a tiny blue bead that cast long distorted shadows across the log walls. Then came the sound. It started high up in the canopy, directly above the shake roof of the cabin. A dry, rhythmic knocking that sounded like 2 heavy hardwood blocks being struck together with deliberate force. Click, click, click. 3 seconds of silence. Then another set of 3 clicks, slightly closer this time, moving down from the high branches of the white oaks to the lower boughs of the hemlocks. The sound wasn't random like wind snapping dead timber. It had a cadence, a deliberate pulse that vibrated through the roof beams and echoed down the cast iron stovepipe. My pulse hammered against my ears, a cold sweat breaking out across my chest as I reached out with a trembling hand and turned the lantern key, extinguishing the blue flame and plunging the cabin into total blackness. I scrambled back toward the iron cot, my boots dragging heavily across the floor, and pulled the scratchy wool blanket up over my head, burying my face into the damp canvas pillow. The darkness beneath the wool was thick and suffocating, smelling of old dust and dry sweat, but it felt like the only barrier between my skin and whatever was descending through the trees. Click, click, click. The sound was directly on the roof now. Heavy iron, hard points striking the cedar shingles with enough force to send tiny flecks of dried moss dropping down onto my blanket. The weight above me shifted, the wooden rafters groaning under a massive concentrated mass that moved slowly from the eastern eave toward the center ridgepole. It moved with a strange crawling gait, 3 points of contact scraping against the wood, dragging something long and heavy behind it that made a dry, rasping sound like a sack of wet sand being pulled across stone. My hand reached instinctively for the heavy metal flashlight sitting on the small crate beside my cot, my fingers wrapping around the cold aluminum casing. Every survival instinct I had built over 8 years screamed at me to click the switch, to throw a 3, 100 lumen beam of light up at the ceiling and see what was standing 6 inches above my head. The urge was almost physical, a violent pressure in my forearms, pushing my thumb toward the rubber button. But Carl Remy's warning burned behind my closed eyelids. Do not shine your flashlight upward. I forced my hand away from the switch, pressing my knuckles hard against my teeth to keep from gasping as the roof directly above my head sagged downward 3 inches. The dried mortar between the chestnut logs cracking under the strain. Click, click, click. The clicking sound shifted from the wood of the roof to the single glass window pane. 3 sharp metallic taps against the leaded glass, so hard I expected the frame to shatter into 1,000 shards. Then came the voice. Or what tried to pass for a voice. It came from directly outside the thin glass, low and wet, vibrating through the log walls with a flat hollow timbre that had no rise or fall. It didn't sound like a human throat producing words. It sounded like someone playing a recorded tape through a broken speaker underwater. Ethan, it said, pronouncing my name with a strange mechanical pause between the 2 syllables. Ith, and you left your measuring tape in the grass. Come out and take it back. My blood turned to slush in my veins. The voice was a precise imitation of the Park Service hiring agent from the ranger station in Tennessee, down to the slight gravelly drawl in his throat, but it was dead, completely devoid of breath or cadence, repeated in an endless flat loop against the glass. Come out and take it back. Come out and take it back. I gripped the edges of the wool blanket, pulled it tighter over my head, and began to count backward in my head, focusing every ounce of my fading sanity on the numbers. 199, 98 outside. The heavy weight slid off the roof with a sickening wet thud that shook the cabin floorboard, landing on the soft dirt of the front yard. The footsteps that followed were slow and uneven. One heavy metallic strike, followed by a wet dragging sound, circling the cabin in a tight clockwise loop, scraping against the exterior logs as it passed. 97, 96, 95. The creature stopped at the front door, the heavy oak panel groaning as something massive leaned against it from the outside. The iron latch lifted half an inch with a slow, rusty screech, holding for 3 agonizing seconds before dropping back into its keeper with a loud clank. A long, bubbling sigh drifted through the keyhole, smelling of cold river mud, stale copper, and ancient rot. 94, 93, 92. The clicking started again, but this time it was moving away, ascending rapidly up the trunk of the massive tulip poplar near the turnaround, rising through the branches 10 feet at a time until the dry wooden knocking sounded faint and distant near the high crest of the ridge. I stayed under the blanket, my legs shaking violently against the iron frame of the cot, my lungs gasping for the hot, stale air trapped beneath the wool. I didn't stop counting until I reached 1, and even then, I didn't lower the blanket from my face until the cold blue light of dawn began to seep through the weave of the fabric, revealing that the window pane was still intact, but covered on the outside by a thick smear of gray river silt that wiped out the morning sun. The pale, sickly daylight filtering through the mud, smeared window pane offered no comfort, revealing only the grim reality of my survival through the 3rd night at Hazel Creek. My body felt broken, every joint aching with a deep, persistent cold that seemed to have settled permanently into my bone marrow. I slid my legs off the iron cot, my feet numb inside my heavy leather boots, and sat motionless for several minutes, listening intently to the absolute silence that enveloped the valley once again. The heavy air inside the cabin was thick with the lingering stench of stagnant river silt and old rust, a suffocating reminder of the thing that had stood on the other side of my front door just hours before. I rubbed my face with both hands, feeling the rough stubble along my jaw, and forced myself to stand, my knees cracking sharply in the quiet room. Walking over to the wooden table, I picked up Carl Remy's bound journal with cold, stiff fingers, turning the damp, fragile pages until I reached the 4th rule. Rule 4. If you discover a rusted tin can filled with river stones on your doorstep, it means your presence is recorded. Do not leave your cabin after midnight. I closed the book, tucked it securely inside my heavy oilskin coat, and reached for the iron door handle, lifting the latch with deliberate slowness to avoid making a sound. As the door swung open against the morning chill, my eyes immediately dropped to the wooden porch steps. Sitting dead center on the top plank was a rusted steel soup can, its faded paper label long since rotted away, filled to the brim with wet, dark gray river pebbles that glistened under the pale light. A thick, foul-smelling moisture was slowly leaking from the bottom of the tin, pooling on the dry pine wood like grease. I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath hitching in my chest as the cold reality of my situation tightened like a vice around my ribs. My presence was no longer just tolerated or monitored. It was recorded. The forest knew I was here, and it was marking time. I stepped carefully over the can, refusing to touch it or disturb the stones, and walked out into the clearing toward my truck. The damp mountain grass was flattened in long, wide swaths radiating outward from the cabin steps, as if several heavy, soft-bodied objects had been dragged around the perimeter, while I lay hiding under my blanket. My Ford pickup sat in the dim light, its windows covered in a thick layer of interior condensation that obscured the cab. As I approached the driver's side, I saw that the geometric spiral of steel tools from the previous morning was gone, leaving only deep, scorched-looking indentations in the damp earth where the metal had rested. I unlocked the door, the key turning with a stiff, dry screech that made my shoulders tense, and pulled the driver's door open. Sitting on the center of the bench seat was my heavy canvas tool pouch, neatly unzipped and laid wide open. Inside, arranged in neat, parallel lines, were 3 smooth, oval river stones, each wrapped tightly in a thick layer of wet gray hair that looked sickeningly human. I slammed the door shut, leaning my forehead against the cold glass of the window, fighting off a sudden wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. There was no point in pretending anymore. The survey work, the Park Service contract, the $1,200 a week, none of it mattered. The Hazel Creek watershed was not a piece of government land waiting to be mapped. It was a trap, a closed loop governed by ancient, malicious rules that Carl Remy had barely managed to document before he vanished. I turned back toward the cabin, knowing I had to gather my essential supplies and prepare for the long, dangerous walk out of the hollow before the twilight returned. As I reached the porch, the silence of the morning was shattered by a sudden, violent crack that echoed down from the ridge above, sounding like a dynamite charge detonating deep within the timber. The sound was immediately followed by the sickening groan of splintering wood. A massive, ancient white oak, standing at least 80 feet tall, near the bend of the main access trail, tipped forward and crashed to the ground with a earth-shaking thud that vibrated through the soles of my boots. Clouds of dead leaves, pine needles, and crushed branches erupted into the air, obscuring the path leading back toward the iron bridge. Before the echoes of the first crash had even faded, a second, equally loud explosion echoed from the western ridge, followed by another massive tree falling across the lower trail. Then a third and a fourth. The forest was systematically closing its doors, felling its giant timber across every known path of exit, cutting off the cabin from the outside world. I ran to the edge of the clearing, my boots tearing through the wet moss, and stopped at the tree line. Through the settling dust and gray fog, I could see the massive trunk of the fallen oak lying completely across the dirt track, its thick branches twisted and shattered into an impassable wooden wall. But it wasn't just a natural fall. As I stepped closer, my eyes caught the stark, horrifying detail of the stump. The tree hadn't been cut with an axe or a chainsaw, nor had it been snapped by the wind. The heavy 4-foot trunk looked as though it had been twisted from above, its massive oak fibers shredded and wrung out like a wet towel, until the base gave way under immense, unnatural torque. Small droplets of dark, viscous resin were oozing from the twisted wood, pooling in the crushed leaves below with a faint, hissing sound. From deep within the thick brush beyond the fallen oak, a low, wet rustling began, accompanied by the distinct, dry clicking of wooden joints. They were watching from behind the barricade, waiting to see if I would attempt to climb over the fallen timber. Carl Remy's fifth rule flashed through my mind like a warning beacon in the dark. Should the timber trail be blocked by freshly felled oak trees forming a barrier, never turn back toward the valley. You must cross the dry creek bed where the water runs silent. I took a slow step backward away from the fallen giant, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark gaps between the shattered branches, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The main trail was gone, my truck was useless, and the sun was already beginning its brief, sickly arc across the gray sky above Hazel Creek. My only path out of this nightmare lay through the dry, silent creek bed deep in the bottom of the gorge, a place where no sun ever reached, and where the rules of the mountain were enforced with absolute, unyielding severity. I turned on my heel and walked rapidly back toward the cabin to pack my gear, knowing that when night fell again, the walls of chestnut logs would offer no protection at all. The return to the cabin was a brief, frantic scramble, every second dropping like heavy, cold stone into the narrow well of my remaining daylight. I grabbed my heavy canvas rucksack from beside the iron cot, shoving my remaining tins of beef, my brass compass, and a small roll of friction tape into the main pocket. I tucked Carl Remy's vinyl notebook deep into the waterproof lining against my back, feeling its stiff corners press hard against my shoulder blades. The cabin felt hollow now, stripped of whatever false sense of shelter it had offered over the past 4 days, its air thick with the smell of old soot, wet river silt, and my own stale panic. I glanced at the rough pine table one last time, where the rusted soup, filled with wet gray pebbles, sat untouched on the porch steps outside, its thick fall moisture still seeping into the dry grain of the wood. I didn't look back as I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, letting the iron latch drop into its keeper with a dull final thud that echoed through the empty yard. I struck out toward the eastern gorge, keeping off the main trail entirely and navigating through the dense tangle of mountain laurel and wild briar that clawed at my oilskin coat. My boots sank 3 inches deep into the black saturated leaf mold with every step, making a wet suction sound that felt dangerously loud in the heavy silence. Overhead, the sky was already turning from a sickly milky gray into a bruised deep indigo, the mountain shadows stretching long skeletal fingers across the ravine as the sun dropped behind the sharp spine of the ridge. After 20 minutes of downhill descent through the thick brush, the ground gave way to a steep bank of loose shale and jagged granite boulders, sliding down on my hands and knees, my leatherwork gloves scraping against the cold, sharp edges of the stone. I tumbled out into the bottomland, where the dry bed of Hazel Creek carved its path through the dark heart of the valley. The creek bed was a vast, desolate trench of dry gray boulders and smooth river silt, totally devoid of running water, as if the mountain had swallowed the stream whole miles above. The limestone rocks were bleached a pale, ghostly white, stripped clean of any algae or river moss, standing like broken rows of teeth protruding from the dark gravel. The air down here was noticeably colder, dropping 20 degrees below the ridgeline, carrying a sharp metallic tang that filled my mouth with the taste of copper and crushed bone. I stood at the edge of the dry channel, my lungs burning with short, shallow breaths, and reached into my coat to pull out the notebook, flipping to the unwritten corollary Carl Remy had scribbled beneath the 5th rule in thin, frantic lines. When you enter the dry basin, step only on the stones that bear no shadow, keep your eyes on the dry ground 3 feet ahead of your boots, and never speak a word to the quiet. I took my first step onto the dry riverbed, my heavy leather boot landing flat on a large sandstone boulder. The stone made no sound under my weight, absorbing the impact as if it were made of soft, dry wool. I took another step, then another, establishing a slow, rhythmic gait down the middle of the riverbed, keeping my head bowed low and my eyes fixed strictly on the pale stones directly in front of my toes. 3 feet ahead, no further, the silence in the gorge was absolute, so heavy and dense that the sound of my own heart beating felt like a muffled drum echoing inside my skull. But after 50 paces, the nature of the silence shifted. Beneath the quiet, a faint rhythmic vibration began to rise up through the soles of my boots, shaking my ankles with a subtle pulsing beat. It was not the sound of water or wind, but a low, dry scraping, like a dozen heavy wooden blocks being dragged across raw stone in unison, moving along the high shale banks on both sides of the gorge, keeping pace with my exact speed. I kept my gaze locked on the rocks, refusing to raise my chin even an inch toward the dark tree line above. 4 feet to my left, the shadow of a tree trunk stretched across the dry gravel under the faint moonlight. But as I watched, the shadow detached itself from the base of the oak, lengthening into a long, distorted shape, with multiple jointed limbs that crawled across the stones without making a sound. It moved with a strange liquid motion, its dark outline pooling around the edges of the boulders before sliding toward the toes of my boots. Carl Remy's warning burned in my mind. Step only on the stones that bear no shadow. I shifted my weight violently to the right, my boot barely missing the dark edge of the shadow, and leaped to a flat white rock sitting in the bright pale moonlight. My heel slid on a patch of dry silt, my left arm swinging wildly to catch my balance as my rucksack shifted heavy against my spine. A sharp, cold draft swept across my neck, carrying the thick reek of wet dog fur and old blood, smelling as though something had leaned its mouth directly over my collar. From the dark laurel thicket on the eastern bank came a voice, low and raspy, sounding like dried leaves being ground together in a fist. "Ethan," it called out, using my name with that same mechanical flat cadence. "Eth, and your contract is not finished. You haven't marked the 6th section." The voice was a perfect replica of my father's voice, dead 6 years now, carrying the exact pitch and quiet rasp he used when calling me in from the fields at dusk. My throat tightened into a hard, dry knot, a sudden desperate urge to turn my head and look toward the bank surging through my chest with terrifying force. My muscles locked up, my chin quivering as it fought against my own willpower. Trying to lift toward the sound, I bit down on the inside of my cheek until the salty taste of warm blood filled my mouth, using the sharp physical pain to anchor my mind to the dry stones beneath my feet. 3 feet ahead, I told myself, 3 feet ahead, 647 north, 239 west, section 4, township 8. I repeated the district survey coordinates over and over in my head like a protective shield, forcing my boots to move forward step by step through the shadow, draped rocks. The clicking on the banks grew faster, louder, turning into a frantic, chaotic drumbeat of wooden joints striking the shale. Click, 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 click. Descending the steep slope toward the dry creek bed, small pebbles came rolling down the embankment, bouncing off the limestone boulders around me, but I did not look up. I picked up my pace into a rapid, jarring walk, my boots striking the dry stones in a relentless tempo as the darkness in the gorge deepened into total blackness. Ahead through the gloom, where the dry creek bed made a wide, sweeping curve to the west, I saw the pale, misty expanse of the lower lake gleaming under the faint starlight. The end of the watershed was less than 100 yards away, but standing right at the mouth of the gorge, where the dry gravel met the dark, still water of the lake. 3 tall, thin figures were standing silent in the shallows, waiting for me to step out of the dry basin. The 3 figures stood motionless at the mouth of the gorge, framed against the flat, obsidian mirror of the lower lake, where the dry creek bed dissolved into black water. They did not sway. They did not breathe. Their long silhouettes stretched thin and jagged over the wet gravel like charred timber, left behind by a forest fire. My boots came to a halt 20 feet back in the dry channel, the heels sinking deep into the cold silt, my lungs burning as I forced myself to keep my gaze anchored to the damp rocks at my feet. 3 feet ahead, no further, the air between us felt thick and electric, heavy with the sharp smell of old river mud, wet hair, and stale copper that coated the back of my tongue like grease. From the shale banks high above my head, the frantic clicking instantly ceased, cut off in a fraction of a second, as if a thick wool blanket had been thrown over the entire valley. The forest went dead silent, an absolute, crushing quiet that pressed against my eardrums until the pounding of my own pulse sounded like a heavy wooden hammer striking soft soil. I stood in the shadow of the steep rock face, my oilskin coat heavy with cold sweat, feeling Carl Remy's notebook pressing hard against my spine through the canvas of my rucksack. The sixth rule, the final mandate scribbled in those shaky, torn lines on the last page, burned behind my eyes. If you meet them at the edge of the water and they mimic your movements, raise your open palm and give no voice, break the silence, and you belong to the creek. I took a slow, agonizing breath through my nose, forcing my shoulders to drop and my fingers to unclench from the wooden handle of my walking stick, slow step by step, keeping my boots planted firmly on the pale, shadowless stones. I advanced toward the water's edge, my eyes refusing to lift toward their faces, focusing strictly on the wet, pale feet standing bare in the freezing lake margin. The feet were long and grotesquely narrow, the skin a dull, bruised white like the belly of a bloated river fish that had sat 3 days in the sun. The toes ended in short, square yellow nails that gripped the wet gravel, completely unbothered by the icy water lapping around their ankles. As I took another step forward, the figure in the center made its first movement. It did not step toward me. It simply mirrored my exact stance, shifting its long weight onto its left heel. At the precise microsecond my left boot touched the sand, the motion was utterly fluid, lacking the natural sway or micro-adjustments of a human body. It was a mechanical, cold reflection, executed with terrifying accuracy. I stopped 5 paces from the water, the dark lake stretching out into the fog behind them, silent and vast. Slowly, my right arm felt heavy as iron. I lifted my hand to the level of my chest, turning my wrist until my open palm faced directly toward the central figure. The pale, cracked skin of my palm, stained with black oil and pine sap from 4 days in the woods, offered up in total surrender to the quiet. Across the wet gravel, all 3 figures raised their right arms in unison, their limbs moving with a slow, dry creaking sound like ungreased iron hinges, their long, thin hands lifted, palms facing outward toward me. Their fingers were twice the length of my own, tipped with flat, square pads that had pressed those deep handprints into the mud beneath the dead deer on the eastern ledge. In the dim blue starlight filtering through the mist, I finally saw their clothes. They were not wearing furs or monstrous hide. They were clad in the rotting, threadbare remnants of heavy woolen work coats, canvas trousers stiff with ancient mud, and faded flannel shirts whose original colors had been washed out into a dull, uniform gray decade ago. The brass buttons on the central figure's coat were corroded with thick green verdigris, but as my eyes tracked up the frayed collar, I saw the brass buckle of a forestry service belt loop hanging loose around a waist that was impossibly narrow. These were the garments of loggers, surveyors, and homesteaders from a century past, garments that had decayed directly onto the flesh beneath them until cloth and skin had fused into a dry, leather-like shell. The figure on the left tilted its head, a slow, sickening 90-degree twist that made the dry tendons in its neck crackle like snapping dry twigs. Its face was smooth, featureless white leather stretched taut over high, sharp cheekbones with no eyebrows, no eyelashes, and a flat, narrow ridge where a human nose should have been. 2 small, perfectly round dark holes sat beneath the forehead, completely devoid of eyes, iris, or white. Just empty black sockets that seemed to drink the moonlight. Where its mouth should have been, there was only a pale, puckered seam of scarred skin, tightly sealed, as if it had never opened to draw breath or utter a sound in 70 years. A low, wet vibration began in the chest of the central figure, a sound that didn't come from a throat or lungs, but rattled deep within its dry ribcage like a loose pebble in a tin bucket. It began to shape its throat, forcing air up through its closed skin to produce a pitch, perfect imitation of my own voice, using the exact cadence, the exact tired drawl I had used when I signed my name at the ranger station in Tennessee. My own voice came back at me, flat and hollow across the water. "Why don't you talk, Ethan?" it said. The words vibrating through my own chest. "Why don't you tell us what you found on the ridge? Tell us about Carl's book." My jaw locked tight, my teeth grinding together until my gums bled. The urge to scream, to bark out a denial, to demand to know what they were, surged up from my stomach like liquid fire. It hit my throat with physical weight, choking me, forcing tears to well up in the corners of my eyes. Every human instinct demanded that I break the agonizing stillness, that I yell for help into the dark expanse of the lake. But I kept my palm raised, my fingers stiff and unmoving, staring dead ahead at the empty sockets of the central figure, while the blood from my bitten cheek pooled warm and thick under my tongue. The figure on the right took a single step forward, its pale, bare foot breaking the calm surface of the lake with a sharp splash. It raised its hand higher, its long, square, tipped fingers reaching out until they hovered barely 3 inches from my raised palm. The air radiating off its gray skin was so cold it made the hair on my arm freeze solid, smelling of ancient dust, deep cavern air, and dry cedar rot. It held its palm parallel to mine, matching the angle of my hand millimeter for millimeter, waiting for my fingers to tremble, waiting for a single sound to escape my locked lips. I didn't flinch. I didn't breathe. I held my gaze fixed on the empty air between our hands, focusing every shred of my remaining willpower on the single rule that stood between me and the bottom of Hazel Creek. For 3 agonizing minutes, the world stood entirely still. The lake, the forest, the mountain, all holding their breath in the freezing dark. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the central figure lowered its arm. The other 2 followed instantly, their limbs dropping back to their sides with that dry, woody creak. The figure in the center stepped backward into the deep water, its bare feet sinking silently into the black mud. Without turning around, all 3 figures began to glide backward into the lake, their long gray bodies submerging inch by inch into the still, dark water without leaving a single ripple on the surface. The water rose up over their waists, over their narrow chests, over their smooth, eyeless faces, until the pale crown of their heads vanished beneath the black mirror of the lake, leaving only the foggy horizon and the silent shore. I stood alone on the wet gravel, my arm slowly dropping to my side, my entire body shaking violently as I drew a long, ragged gasp of icy air back into my starved lungs. The 6th rule had been kept. The accord was honored. But as I turned my head toward the eastern bank, I saw a narrow, hidden trail cutting up through the hemlocks, marked by a single, ancient iron post driven deep into the moss, bearing a rusted brass plate that read, "Property of the United States Department of Agriculture, restricted entry since 1956. The hidden trail cut upward through the hemlocks like a deep knife wound in the dark earth, its narrow tread choked with decades of rotted pine needles that absorbed the sound of my heavy leather boots. My chest heaved in short, ragged gasps, the cold mountain air burning through my throat like liquid nitrogen. But I didn't dare slow my pace. Every nerve ending in my body was screaming, on fire with the sudden adrenaline rush of escaping the lake edge. But underneath the terror, a colder, sharper realization was beginning to take root in my mind. The brass plate on the ancient iron post had not been a warning from nature or a marker left by panicked homesteaders. It was an official government seal, stamped with the crisp, blocky lettering of a federal agency that had marked this boundary long before I was born. I pulled Carl Remy's notebook from my rucksack with stiff, trembling fingers as I walked, my thumb tracing the worn vinyl spine in the faint blue moonlight filtering through the canopy. Flipping past the 6 rules, my eyes caught a section of pages near the back that had been folded over and sealed with a strip of dark, yellowed electrical tape. I jammed my walking stick under my arm, dug my thumbnail beneath the edge of the tape, and ripped it clear. The pages inside were covered in dense, frantic handwriting, entirely different from the measured, instructional tone of the 6 rules. This was a journal of discovery, a log of a man who had slowly realized that his isolation was not an accident of geography, but a condition of employment. Carl had written these entries during his 3rd week at Hazel Creek in the summer of 1984, his ink bleeding into the damp paper. "They didn't send me here to clear the trail." One entry read, the ink smeared by what looked like dried river silt. "The boundary markers are already set. They have been set since the federal government condemned the valley in 1956 under the Watershed Protection Act. The families never left when the park authority bought out the Hazel Creek Timber Company. 300 residents in the upper basin refused the checks. They locked their cabin doors, cut the bridge cables, and vanished into the high ridges. The government didn't hunt them down. They simply drew a red circle on the regional survey maps, locked the access gates, and created the maintenance contract to make sure nobody else ever walked past the iron bridge. I stopped dead in my tracks, leaning my shoulder against the moss-covered trunk of a massive white oak to steady my footing. The air around me was dead silent, but the silence no longer felt like a predator stalking my steps. It felt like the heavy, deliberate quiet of a vault. The National Park Service hadn't hired me because they needed a surveyor. They needed a line watcher, a warm body to sit in Station 7 for 6 weeks to verify that the boundary was holding, that the agreement forged 70 years ago between the Department of Agriculture and the mountain families remained unbroken. The 6 rules Carl Remy had written weren't survival tactics forged in desperation. They were the terms of a treaty, an operational protocol handed down from one maintenance worker to the next to keep both sides of the ridge alive. I pushed forward up the incline, my boots slipping on the slick red shale where the trail crossed a narrow exposed ridgeline. To my left, the dark void of the Hazel Creek gorge dropped away into absolute blackness. But to my right, through a gap in the dense laurel thicket, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Nested in a deep, horseshoe-shaped hollow 200 feet below the ridge were the silhouettes of nearly a dozen structures. They were not primitive huts or wild nests. They were sturdy, hand-built log cabins, their chestnut timbers weathered to the same pale ash color as Station 7. Stacked stone chimneys rose from the shake roofs, sending thin, straight ribbons of dark smoke up into the night air. There were no electric lights, no lanterns, no fires burning in the yards, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight, I saw movement between the cabins. Figures were walking through the narrow dirt alleys between the structures, moving with slow, deliberate precision, carrying heavy wooden pails and bundles of split timber. They were clad in the same gray, threadbare garments I had seen at the lake shore, their long, pale limbs moving without a sound across the packed earth. In the center of the hollow sat a massive, circular structure built from dry, stacked river boulders, its top left open to the sky. From inside the stone ring, a low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the earth, a sound so deep it bypasses the ears entirely, vibrating directly through the bones of my legs and setting my teeth on edge. I drew back behind a thick clump of rhododendron, my hand pressed flat against my mouth to stifle the sound of my ragged breathing. Carl's handwritten notes flashed in my memory. They don't reproduce like we do. The lineage is closed, preserved. They don't speak because language belongs to the people who took their valley. They use the clicking to count their numbers, to mark the borders of their land, and to signal the maintenance crew when the accord is breached. The government feeds them through the lower basin, dropping supplies twice a year by unmarked helicopters under the cover of military exercises, and in return, the families keep the unmapped ridge empty, guarding the ancient timber from timber companies, miners, and curious eyes. I realized then why the hiring agent in Tennessee had looked away when he slid the truck keys across his mahogany desk, why he had said most boys last 3 days before driving back down the gravel road with their high beams on. He wasn't warning me about monsters. He was checking to see if I had the nerve to keep the secret. If I panicked, if I broke the rules and raised my flashlight or shouted into the canopy, I became a liability, an intruder who had violated the treaty and had to be absorbed by the creek. But if I followed the rules, if I respected the spiral of tools, left the carcass untouched, stayed under the blanket during the clicking, and offered my open palm at the lake, I proved that the system was working, that the boundary line remained intact. A sudden rustle in the laurel thicket 10 feet above my head brought my head snapping up. Standing on a ledge of exposed granite, directly over the trail was a human figure. But it was not one of the smooth, eyeless beings from the lake. It was an old man, leaning heavily on a carved ash staff, dressed in a faded denim work jacket that bore a yellowed Park Service patch from the 1970s. His beard was long, matted with dry moss and resin, reaching down to his waist, and his skin was dark, leathery, and deeply lined by decades of sun and mountain wind. He had eyes, dark and sharp, reflecting the pale moonlight like the eyes of a bobcat crouching in the brush. He didn't lift a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked down at me with a cold, hollow pity that cut deeper than any horror I had faced in the basin. He lifted his right hand, his fingers long and calloused, and pressed his index finger flat against his cracked lips, demanding absolute silence. Then, with his left hand, he pointed down the continuing trail, where the narrow path crested the high ridge and began its long descent toward the outer boundary gate of the national park, 5 miles away from Hazel Creek. I didn't utter a sound. I didn't ask his name, though I knew in my heart that I was looking at Carl Remy, the man who had written the notebook 40 years ago and had chosen to stay behind to keep the watch. I gave him a single, slow nod of my head, adjusted the heavy straps of my rucksack against my aching shoulders, and stepped past his ledge, leaving the dark hollow of Hazel Creek behind as I began my final descent toward the world of the living. The final descent toward the outer boundary gate offered no warmth, no sudden relief, only an agonizingly slow transition from the deep obsidian of the upper basin into a flat, bruised purple that clung to the high ridges like a spreading stain. My legs moved with a wooden, mechanical rhythm, every joint in my knees screaming as my heavy boots barked against the frozen dirt of the ridge trail. Behind me, the vast, unbroken canopy of the restricted watershed stretched out like a dark sea, swallowing every trace of the hollow where the gray cabins nested, swallowing Carl Remy, swallowing the 3 silent figures who still glided beneath the surface of the lower lake. I did not look back over my shoulder, keeping my eyes fixed on the pale ribbon of packed dirt stretching out 2 paces ahead of my boots, holding Carl's notebook tight against my chest inside my oilskin coat like a shield made of damp paper and old ink. The air grew subtly different as I dropped below the 4,000-foot line, the thick, suffocating mineral reek of stagnant river silt and wet copper slowly giving way to the familiar, mundane smells of rotting pine, cold damp earth, and mountain laurel. Yet the silence here remained heavy and artificial, a pressurized quiet that felt as though the entire mountain were holding its breath, watching to ensure I carried out my side of the unwritten contract. Every 50 paces, my boots would pass an ancient iron boundary post driven deep into the moss, its rusted face bearing the same cold, blocky federal stamp, each marker a silent reminder that every step I took had been mapped, calculated, and permitted by men sitting in carpeted offices hundreds of miles away who would never set foot in Hazel Creek. As the trail broadened into an old, disused logging road overgrown with high dead thistle and wild blackberry briars, a sudden sound shattered the morning quiet, cutting through the forest with terrifying clarity. It was not the woody, rhythmic clicking from the high boughs, nor the wet, bubbling sigh of the beings at the lake edge. It was the low, rhythmic hum of a diesel engine idling in the distance, its heavy vibration pulsing through the frozen earth beneath my soles. My pace quickened into a desperate, jarring trot, my rucksack bouncing hard against my spine as I rounded the final sweeping bend of the ridge, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There, standing across the gap where the dirt track met the paved county road, was a massive, 8-foot-high chain link gate topped with 3 strands of razor wire that glinted coldly in the pale dawn light. Hung prominently on the steel mesh was a heavy aluminum sign painted in stark, reflective yellow and black lettering, warning that the area beyond was a federal ecological reserve closed to all public access under penalty of law. Parked just beyond the padlocked gate was a glossy white federal utility vehicle, its engine running smoothly, sending thin plumes of clear exhaust curling up into the freezing morning air. Leaning against the driver's side door, holding a steaming metal thermos in his gloved hands, was a man wearing the crisp, khaki uniform of a senior Park Service administrator, his brass nameplate gleaming under his heavy wool coat. He didn't look surprised to see a battered, mud-soaked surveyor emerging from the restricted zone with torn clothes and blood caked along his jaw. He didn't reach for a radio or ask if I needed medical attention. He simply took a slow sip from his thermos, set it down on the hood of his truck, and unlatched a heavy iron key ring from his belt, walking toward the gate with slow, deliberate steps that showed he had done this exact routine dozens of times before. He inserted the key into the heavy brass padlock, the tumbler clicking open with a loud, metallic snap that felt jarringly normal compared to the nightmare I had left behind. He swung the iron gate open just enough for a single man to pass through, keeping his body positioned between me and the paved road beyond. His eyes, pale gray and completely devoid of warmth or curiosity, swept over my face, taking in the trembling of my jaw, the dark circles beneath my eyes, and the bulky outline of the notebook tucked beneath my coat. "You made it 4 days longer than the last boy," he said, his voice flat, gravelly, and entirely lacking in tone, carrying the exact drawl that the thing outside my cabin window had mimicked with such terrifying precision 3 nights ago. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, manila envelope sealed with red wax, sliding it toward my chest without offering his hand. "Your 6 weeks of contract pay is inside, rounded up to the full amount, along with a standard non-disclosure agreement drafted by the department's legal office in Knoxville. You sign the sheet, slide it back through the truck window, and you leave your personal survey log right here on the hood." I stood in the gap of the gate, one boot planted on the wet gravel of the restricted trail, the other resting on the clear, dry asphalt of the open road. My fingers tightened around the vinyl cover of Carl Remy's journal beneath my coat, feeling the ragged edges of the pages, where 40 years of silence had been recorded. I looked past the administrator's shoulder at the wide, empty highway stretching down toward the valley below, where the sun was finally breaking over the distant peaks, casting long, warm rays of golden light across the world of the living. "What happens if I don't leave the book?" I asked, my voice coming out as a dry, raspy croak that sounded entirely foreign to my own ears, my throat raw from days of holding my breath in the dark. The administrator didn't blink. He didn't shift his weight. He simply looked past me, his eyes fixing on the dark, impenetrable wall of green timber rising up behind my shoulder, where a faint, dry clicking had just begun to echo high up in the foggy canopy of the upper basin. "Nobody leaves Hazel Creek with their voice intact. Ethan," he murmured softly, turning his back on me and walking slowly toward his running truck. "You either sign the paper and keep the quiet, or you go back up the dry creek bed and explain to them why you broke the accord." The heavy manila envelope felt cold and deceptively light in my trembling fingers, its red wax seal stamped with the eagle emblem of the Department of the Interior, standing in the narrow gap between the padlocked chain link gate and the clear, open asphalt of the county road. I looked from the administrative officer's indifferent back to the dark tree line towering behind me, high up in the dense, fog-choked boughs of the white oaks. The dry, rhythmic clicking rose and fell in a slow, hypnotic cadence. Click, click, click. It was no longer a threat or an invitation. It was a heartbeat, the steady, mechanical breathing of a valley that had survived 3 centuries of displacement by retreating into the shadow of its own terrible rules. I reached beneath my oilskin coat, my knuckles white as my fingers wrapped around the worn vinyl cover of Carl Remy's notebook. My mind raced through the long, freezing nights spent under the wool blanket at Station 7, the clean, unzipped cavity of the deer on the eastern ledge, the smooth, eyeless faces gliding backward into the black depths of the lower lake. Carl had spent 40 years in the dark so that whoever came after him might have a chance to walk out with their sanity intact. If I handed his words over to a man who viewed them as nothing more than a breach of contract to be shredded in a Knoxville office, I was erasing the only proof that Carl Remy had ever existed, that his sacrifice meant anything more than a footnote in an unmapped federal filing cabinet. The administrator stood by the open driver's side door of his white utility vehicle, his engine idling with a smooth, rhythmic thrum that sounded jarringly civilized against the vast, ancient silence of the mountains. He pulled a cheap ballpoint pen from his breast pocket and held it out toward me without turning his head, his pale gray eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, as if he couldn't bear to look directly at the gap in the fence. "Sign the bottom line, Ethan," he said, his voice flat, dry, and entirely devoid of human interest. "Slide the notebook onto the hood, and my driver takes you straight to the bus terminal in Bryson City. You go home, you pay off your equipment debts, and you never speak the name of Hazel Creek to another living soul." I took 2 slow steps forward, stepping fully out of the damp shade of the restricted zone and onto the dry, sunlit asphalt. The warmth of the early morning sun hit my face like a hot towel, melting the thin crust of dried sweat, and mud caked along my jaw, but the cold deep inside my chest, the icy, permanent frost settled into my bone marrow, didn't lift. I set my heavy canvas rucksack on the warm metal of the truck's hood, the straps dragging over the clean white paint with a dull scrape. Then, keeping my left hand buried deep inside my coat against the hard, vinyl edge of Carl's book, I took the pen from the administrator's hand and pressed the paper against the hood. My hand hovered over the signature line of the non-disclosure agreement, reading the dense, legalistic jargon designed to erase my 4 days in the basin. The undersigned agrees to surrender all field notes, topographical sketches, and personal logs pertaining to the upper Hazel Creek watershed. I looked down at my own palm. The skin cracked, blackened with pine sap, and scarred where I had bitten through my cheek to keep from screaming at the lake edge. I thought of the 3 pale figures whose fingers had hovered 3 inches from my own, matching my shape, respecting the silence because I had respected the accord. The government hadn't created the rules, they had merely capitulated to them. They built the fence, locked the gate, and paid sacrificial lambs $1,200 a week to ensure the boundary remained unbroken. If I signed the paper and surrendered the book, I was becoming part of the machine that kept the trap baited. I pressed the ballpoint pen into the paper. But instead of writing my name, I drew a long, deliberate line straight through the signature block, pressing so hard the metal tip tore, through the thick bond paper down to the metal of the hood. The administrator didn't move a muscle, but the low hum of the truck engine seemed to drop an octave, the air around the vehicle growing instantly tense. "You're making a catastrophic mistake," he murmured softly, his hand dropping slowly to his belt, where a small black radio sat in a leather holster. "I didn't sign it," I said, my voice low and raspy, but clear enough to cut through the idle of the diesel engine. "And I'm keeping the notebook. But you don't have to worry about me talking to the press or selling stories to the Knoxville papers, because nobody in that town would believe a single word of what's written in these pages anyway. They'd put me in an asylum before they sent a survey team up this ridge." I slid my personal survey log, the mundane notebook filled with boundary, spike counts, and elevation estimates from my first 2 days, out from my side pocket and tossed it onto the hood beside the manila envelope. Carl's journal stayed firmly where it belonged, pressed against my ribs beneath my oilskin coat. I backed away from the white truck, my heavy boots striking the asphalt in a steady, backward retreat toward the southern shoulder of the county road where the public right of way began. The administrator turned his head slowly, his pale gray eyes locking onto mine, with a look that was neither angry nor surprised. It was a look of cold, bureaucratic exhaustion. He reached down, picked up my survey log and the unsigned manila envelope, and tossed them onto the passenger's seat before stepping up into the cab of his truck. He leaned his arm out the open window, staring at me as the heavy tires began to roll slowly forward down the winding mountain road. "You think you escaped because you walked through the gate, Ethan," he called out over the rumble of the exhaust, his voice carrying that same flat, gravelly cadence that had echoed outside my cabin window 3 nights ago. "But you carried their quiet out with you. You kept your palm raised. You didn't break the silence. And now you belong to the creek just as much as Carl does. Every time you hear wood snapping in the dark, every time you hear 2 taps on a window pane, you'll remember the 6 rules, and you'll count backward from 100. The white truck rounded the curve, its red tail lights flashing once before disappearing into the thick rhododendron thickets that lined the highway, leaving me standing alone on the empty ribbon of asphalt that stretched down into the valley. The early morning sun was fully up now, casting bright, warm light across the forest floor. But as I stood on the shoulder of the road, I turned my head back toward the massive chain link gate. The iron bars stood tall and silent, blocking out the dark, impenetrable wilderness of Hazel Creek. But high up in the white oaks, way beyond the fence, a single dry click echoed through the canopy, subtle, deliberate, and perfectly clear, acknowledging that the accord had been kept, and that the unmapped ridge was waiting for the next surveyor to sign the contract. The paved road down the mountain felt wrong under my boots, every footstep striking the asphalt with an unnatural, jarring impact that echoed up through my ankles. After 3 hours of walking towards civilization, a rusted blue Ford farm truck pulled over on the gravel shoulder, its driver a weather-beaten old farmer who smelled of cut hay and diesel fuel. He didn't ask where I had come from, and he didn't comment on my blood-caked jaw, my torn oilskin coat, or the dark, hollow stare that I couldn't shake from my eyes. He simply nodded, let me toss my canvas rucksack into the bed, and drove me in total silence to the Greyhound terminal in Bryson City. The bus ride back to Knoxville passed in a blur of gray highway, neon gas station signs, and the low, mindless hum of strangers talking on cell phones to the people sitting around me. The world was simple, predictable, and governed by streetlights, traffic laws, and monthly mortgage payments. They looked at me with slight disgust. A dirty, unwashed man staring out the window with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, completely unaware that less than 80 miles away, the mountain was breathing through its own dark, unmapped rules. Beneath my coat, Carl Remy's notebook pressed hard against my ribs, a cold, heavy anchor binding me to the basin I had left behind. When I finally reached my small, rented apartment on the outskirts of Knoxville, the familiar room felt small, suffocating, and terrifyingly fragile. I didn't turn on the electric lights. I didn't check my bank account to see if the $1,200 a week had been wired into my account. I simply locked the door, pushed a heavy wooden dresser across the frame, and sat at my kitchen table with Carl's book lying open beneath the pale glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I spent the entire night reading every page from start to finish, studying the delicate, shaky ink diagrams Carl had drawn of the ridge, the boundary markers, and the hidden hollow. On the very last page, beneath the 6th rule, Carl had written a final paragraph that he had never finished, dated October 14, 1986. The treaty isn't meant to protect us from them. His faded handwriting read, it's meant to protect them from what we would do to this valley if we knew the truth. The federal government doesn't keep Hazel Creek closed out of fear of monsters. They keep it closed because some things in this country are older than our laws, older than our maps. And if you give the world a reason to clear the trees, the silence dies forever. If you're reading this, whoever you are, take my place on the line. Keep the quiet and let the ridge stay unmapped. I closed the book, running my fingers over the cold, worn vinyl, a strange, heavy piece settling over my chest. The Park Service administrator had been right about one thing. I hadn't truly escaped Hazel Creek. The quiet had followed me out through the gate, settled deep into my bones, and rewritten the way I saw the world. I knew I would never go back to survey work. I would never draw another legal property line or drive another iron boundary spike into the earth for a private land developer. My job as an ordinary surveyor was over. 3 days later, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single key to a post office box in town, a cashier's check for $7,200, and a printed slip of paper bearing a single line of text: Station 7 remains vacant until October. I didn't cash the check. I didn't burn the paper. I simply filed the slip inside Carl Remy's notebook and placed the volume inside a locked steel box beneath my bed, beside my old brass compass and my leatherwork gloves. Now, when night falls over Knoxville and the city noise dies down, I sit in the dark by my living room window, watching the wind move through the maple trees in the yard. Sometimes, when the wind blows hard from the east, coming down from the dark, Jagged peaks of the Great Smoky Mountains. I hear a faint, dry knocking against the glass. Click, click, click. Deliberate, steady, and perfectly clear. I don't reach for a light. I don't open the window. I simply raise my open palm toward the glass, give no voice, and begin to count backward from 100.